On March 17, 1982, the secrets of a harsh winter in the Missouri Ozark Hills began to be revealed by Springs Dell. It was on this day that an assistant social worker named Margaret Wilson visited an isolated cabin in Shannon County. Her discovery would forever change her understanding of the limits of social isolation and the consequences of institutional neglect within America's rural communities. The Shelton property was located 27 kilometers from the nearest city, Current River. It was accessible only by a dirt road that turned impassable during the spring rains. For over 3 decades, the family had lived with virtually no contact with the exterior world. Margaret's visit was motivated by an anonymous complaint received by the Missouri Department of Social Services, which claimed that children were living in unhealthy conditions and possibly suffering abuse. At the property, Margaret was received by Elijah Shelton, 47, a man of median stature with a gray beard and intense blue eyes that seemed to carry the weight of generations of isolation. Living in the cabin with Elijah were his sister, Martha Shelton, 43, and 3 children: Thomas, 12, Suddy, 9, and little Jacob, only 5 years old. Built by Elijah's grandfather in the 1920s, the cabin was a wooden structure with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a living room. A small barn, a vegetable garden, and a well were included on the property. There was no piped water or electricity. Their isolation was nearly total, with only occasional trips to the city for supplies they could not produce themselves. The climate that day was mild, with a temperature of 17 degrees and a partially cloudy sky. The recent defrost had left the ground around the cabin muddy, and the air carried the characteristic smell of wetland and decaying wood. During her initial inspection, Margaret noticed the children showed signs of light malnutrition and a lack of basic medical care. On his right arm, Thomas had a badly healed scar, the result of an axe accident the previous year. Suddy had a light strabismus that had never been treated. The youngest, Jacob, showed signs of cognitive development delay for his age. What caught Margaret's attention, however, were the physical similarities shared between the children and the 2 adults. All of them shared striking features: the same intense blue eyes, the same facial bone structure, the same ear shape. These were characteristics that suggested not just kinship, but a very close consanguinity. When asked about the children's mother, Elijah hesitated for a moment before answering that his wife had died during Jacob's delivery. Martha remained silent, avoiding eye contact with the social worker. It was at this moment that Margaret began to suspect the story made no sense. No wedding certificate for Elijah Shelton could be found in county records. In fact, the only documents located were the birth certificates of Elijah and Martha, children of Harold and Edith Shelton, and a land ownership record dated from 1924. The children themselves had no official birth certificates. After the death of Elijah and Martha's parents in a fire in 1973, the Shelton family had gradually become more isolated. Since that time, the brothers had cut almost every bond with the local community, visiting the city for basic needs only. Residents of Current River described Elijah as a reserved and suspicious man who avoided prolonged interactions. The first suspicions that Martha could be the biological mother of the children began to form in Margaret's mind as she observed the familiar dynamics. It was the way Jacob clung to Martha's skirts, how she intuitively knew the needs of each child, and how her gaze revealed a deep maternal bond that seemed to go beyond that of an aunt. If you want to follow more cases like this, cases which shake society as a whole and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any investigation. A week after Margaret Wilson's initial visit, on March 24, 1982, the formal investigation of the Shelton case began. The Missouri Department of Social Services, in conjunction with the Shannon County Sheriff, sent a team to evaluate the situation. This team consisted of Margaret, Police Officer David Tanner, and pediatrician Dr. Robert Hayes. The team's first obstacle was Elijah's resistance. When confronted with more direct questions about the children's origin, he became defensive, claiming that the authorities had no right to interfere with the life of his family. "We take care of ours," he repeated, a phrase that would later reveal itself to be loaded with disturbing meaning. Martha, in turn, remained silent, responding only with monosyllables when questioned directly. The sea settings demonstrated a mix of curiosity and fear in relation to the visitors, revealing their limited contact with people outside the family core. Dr. Hayes performed basic physical examinations on the children and observed several worrying signs. Beyond mild malnutrition and a lack of preventive medical care, he observed physical characteristics that could indicate genetic problems consistent with endogamy. Thomas had polydactyly, an extra finger on his left hand. Suddy had problems with dental development, and Jacob showed signs of cognitive impairment more severe than initially perceived. These signs, when observed in isolation, can have several causes, Dr. Hayes explained in his report. But when observed together, added to the shared physical characteristics and the family isolation, they raise serious concerns about possible consanguinity. The investigation took a more accurate course when the team obtained access to the family's few medical records. Back in 1970, Martha had been treated in a hospital in a neighboring county after a domestic accident. The doctor had observed that she was 3 months pregnant. However, there was no record of any birth or adoption from that period. A deeper search of the records revealed a pattern. Martha had been treated at different hospitals in the region in 1970, 1973, and 1977, years that would correspond approximately to the ages of Thomas, Suddy, and Jacob. On each occasion, she had used different names, but basic physical descriptions and medical data indicated it was the same person. The investigation found a significant obstacle when Elijah, sensing the direction of events, prevented investigators from entering the property. Legally, without concrete evidence of severe abuse or neglect, the authorities had limited options for intervention. It was at this moment that a crucial witness emerged. Sarah Jenkins, an 83-year-old woman who lived about 5 kilometers from the Shelton property, contacted Margaret after hearing rumors about the investigation. Sarah revealed that she had been a friend of Edith, the mother of Elijah and Martha, and that she had maintained sporadic contact with the family even after their isolation. Edith was always afraid that something like this would happen, Sarah said. Harold kept the family isolated, saying that the world was corrupt and that they could only trust in their own blood. When they died in that fire, I tried to help the boys, but Elijah was already too similar to his father, suspicious, hostile. Sarah revealed that she had visited the cabin a few times after the death of the parents, carrying supplies and offering assistance. During one of these visits in 1971, she noticed that Martha was visibly pregnant. When she questioned him about it, Elijah expelled her from the property and forbade her from returning. "I should have done something at that time," lamented Sarah. "But who would have believed me? And where would these children go? The system doesn't take good care of ours here." Sarah's testimony provided important context, but it was not definitive proof. The investigation needed concrete evidence to intervene. A turnaround occurred when one of the agents, revising the birth records of Elijah and Martha, discovered something intriguing. Their parents, Harold and Edith Shelton, had shared the same surname before marriage. Subsequent investigations revealed that they were first cousins. "This is not uncommon in isolated communities like this one," explained a local historian consulted by the team. In the early decades of the 20th century, many families in mountainous regions lived so isolated that marriages between nearby relatives ended up happening due to a lack of options. In some cases, this became almost a family tradition, justified by beliefs about the purity of blood. This discovery shed new light on the case. It was not just a possible incestuous relationship between Elijah and Martha, but potentially a pattern of generational endogamy that had intensified throughout the generations. The team developed a new theory. Elijah and Martha's parents, already cousins, had transmitted isolationist beliefs to their children. After the parents' death, the siblings, already socially isolated and possibly influenced by distorted ideas about family and purity, had established an incestuous relationship that resulted in the birth of 3 children. The investigation briefly found an obstacle when a local resident claimed to have seen a different woman on the Shelton property in the early 1970s. This information briefly reinforced the theory that a third person could have been involved, perhaps a wife of Elijah who later disappeared. However, subsequent investigations revealed that the witness had probably confused the property or the date. Sheriff John Pearson, in relation to the allegations, began to consider obtaining a court order to collect DNA samples from the children and the adults. However, The legal process would be complicated, especially considering the family's isolation and the lack of conclusive evidence of abuse or neglect that would justify such an invasive intervention. "We have to act carefully here," argued the sheriff. "These people have lived this way for generations. For them, this is their normal way of life. If we invade the property without concrete evidence, we could lose any chance of helping these children." The investigation reached an impasse that would last for several months. During that period, the Department of Social Services maintained regular visits to the property, monitoring the children's well-being and gradually trying to build a relationship of trust with the family. The real turnaround in the Shelton case occurred in September 1982, 6 months after the investigation began. During one of her routine visits to the property, Margaret Wilson noticed that Jacob, the youngest, had a high fever and showed signs of a severe respiratory infection. Despite Elijah's initial resistance, she managed to convince him to allow the child to be taken to the hospital in West Plains, the next largest city. At the hospital, Dr. Michael Brennan, a genetic specialist who had been consulted on the case, took the opportunity to perform more in-depth examinations with the reluctant consent of Elijah, who had accompanied his son. The results of Jacob's exams revealed multiple subtle congenital anomalies that individually could have gone unnoticed, but together formed a pattern consistent with a high degree of consanguinity. "The genetic markers we are observing here," Dr. Brennan told the research team, "are typical of children born from relationships between first-degree brothers. There is an excessive homozygosity that is excessive even for a relationship between first-degree cousins." During the 2 weeks of Jacob's hospitalization due to complications from pneumonia, Martha remained constantly by his side, demonstrating striking maternal care and anxiety. It was during this period that Martha, physically and emotionally exhausted, finally began to open up to Margaret. One night, while Jacob slept under the influence of medication, Martha shared fragments of her story. She talked about the growing isolation after their parents' death, how Elijah gradually assumed the role of family patriarch, and how the limits between family roles began to become confused. "We didn't know anyone," Martha confessed in an almost inaudible whisper. "Elijah said the outside world wanted to separate us, to hurt us. We could only trust each other." Although Martha did not explicitly admit to being the children's biological mother in this conversation, her words and emotions made the situation increasingly clear to Margaret. The social worker, taking extreme care not to break the fragile confidence being established, avoided asking direct questions about paternity, focusing instead on offering emotional support. Meanwhile, the documentary investigation continued. A significant advance occurred when researchers located a traveling pastor, Reverend Samuel Miller, who had visited isolated communities in the Ozark Hills during the 1960s and 1970s. Reverend Miller kept detailed diaries of his visits, including observations on the families he encountered. In an entry dated June 1969, he described a visit to the Shelton property. "I visited the Shelton family today. Their parents recently died in tragic circumstances, leaving 2 adult children, Elijah, 34, and Martha, 30. I found them living in extreme poverty and isolation. I offered spiritual and material assistance, but was received with suspicion, especially by the young Elijah. Something in the dynamics between the brothers seemed disturbing to me. Martha looked submissive, almost fearful. I fear that without the moderating influence of their parents, isolationist as they were, the situation may deteriorate. I intend to return, but I confess I felt powerless." A later entry from April 1971 was even more revealing. "I returned to the Shelton property after almost 2 years. I was prevented from entering by Elijah, who seemed even more hostile and paranoid. From afar, I could see Martha briefly. She seemed to be in an advanced state of pregnancy. When I mentioned this to Elijah, suggesting they might need medical attention, he was furious, accusing me of spreading lies and threatening to assault me if I did not leave immediately. I reported my concerns to the local sheriff, but they said that without concrete evidence of abuse, nothing could be done. These mountains keep their secrets, and I fear that some of them are too dark to bear the light of day." Reverend Miller's diary provided the first contemporary evidence of Martha's pregnancy, corroborating the investigation's suspicions. Another crucial event occurred when the authorities managed to locate medical records from a Springfield hospital where Martha had been treated in 1977 under the name Mary Smith. The records confirmed that she had been hospitalized in advanced labor and had given birth to a boy with multiple health complications, including breathing problems and a slight cardiac defect. The date of birth coincided with Jacob's approximate age. The medical team at the time had noted concerns about possible genetic abnormalities and suggested more tests, but Mary Smith had left the hospital against medical advice as soon as her condition and that of the baby had stabilized. While Jacob recovered in the hospital, Dr. Brennan, with limited judicial authorization, performed additional examinations that revealed the boy had a rare genetic condition called Apert syndrome, characterized by malformations of the skull, face, hands, and feet. This syndrome can occur spontaneously, but its incidence increases significantly in cases of close consanguinity. Based on the new evidence, Judge Eleanor Simmons issued a warrant authorizing DNA tests on all the Shelton children and adults. The results, obtained in November 1982, were conclusive. Elijah was the biological father and Martha the biological mother of all 3 children. Leave a comment. Never give up on the truth if you believe all cases of family abuse deserve to be investigated, no matter how isolated the community. On December 7, 1982, based on the genetic evidence and testimonials collected, Elijah Shelton was formally accused of incest, a Class D crime in Missouri, punishable by up to 4 years in prison. Martha, considered a victim due to evidence of prolonged psychological coercion, did not face criminal accusations, but her ability to care for the children was questioned in court. Elijah Shelton's trial began in February 1983 and attracted significant regional media attention, despite efforts to keep the case relatively discreet and protect the children's privacy. The Shannon County Court hosted one of the most complex and morally challenging cases in its history. During the trial, Elijah's defense, led by public defender Gerald Thompson, argued that the extreme isolation and dysfunctional environment in which he had been raised had compromised his ability to discern basic social and moral norms. Thompson presented evidence that Harold and Edith Shelton, parents of Elijah and Martha, had deliberately isolated their children, depriving them of formal education and normal social contact. The defendant, argued Thompson, is the product of generational isolation and possibly of previous endogamy. He himself is the son of first cousins who raised him believing that the outside world was hostile and that the family should remain introspective. The prosecution, represented by Amanda Lewis, recognized the attenuating circumstances but maintained that Elijah understood the nature of his actions. The defendant demonstrated an ability to interact with the community when necessary, to conduct basic business, and to deliberately hide the true nature of his relationship with his sister, Lewis argued. These are not the actions of someone unable to distinguish right from wrong. Martha Shelton testified behind closed doors. Edited excerpts from her testimony, subsequently disclosed, revealed a pattern of psychological manipulation that began after her parents' death when she was 29 and Elijah was 33. According to Martha, Elijah gradually assumed full control over all aspects of her life, isolating her more and more and convincing her that the outside world represented a threat to their safety and family unit. "He told us we were special," said Martha. "That our blood was pure, that our children would be strong because they wouldn't be contaminated by the outside world. At first I resisted, but after years alone with him, I started to believe." Dr. Richard Foster, a psychiatrist specializing in social isolation and abusive family dynamics, witnessed as an expert, explaining to the jury the profound effects of extreme isolation and prolonged indoctrination. "What we see here is a classic case of an alternative reality constructed through isolation. When a person is systematically excluded from all normative social references, their perception of what is acceptable can be radically distorted." The trial also highlighted the failure of local institutions to identify and intervene in the situation. Evidence revealed that concerns had been expressed by at least 3 different people over the years: Reverend Miller, the neighbor Sarah Jenkins, and an employee of the Current River Supply Store who had noticed the similarities between the children and the adults who occasionally visited. In none of these cases was there proper follow-up by the authorities, revealing systemic failures in monitoring isolated communities and in protecting vulnerable people in remote rural areas. After 2 weeks of testimony, The jury found Elijah Shelton guilty of incest but recommended leniency due to attenuating circumstances. Judge Eleanor Simmons sentenced him to 3 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 months and ordered compulsory psychological treatment. In her final statement, Judge Simmons noted, "This case represents a collective failure not just of the defendant, who is still responsible for his actions, but of a society that allows entire families to be placed beyond the reach of our protection and support systems." Geographical isolation should not mean institutional abandonment. As for the children, the court ordered them to remain temporarily under state custody while Martha received intensive psychological treatment. The ultimate goal was family reunification, provided Martha demonstrated the capacity to properly care for the children and integrate them into the wider community. The children were placed in a foster home in a neighboring county where they began to receive formal education and medical treatment for their various conditions. Thomas, the eldest, demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability, rapidly catching up to his peers educationally. Despite her initial delay, Suddy had more difficulties with social adaptation but responded well to treatment for her strabismus and other health problems. Jacob, the youngest and most severely affected by genetic disorders, underwent several surgeries to correct his malformations and started intensive care for his developmental delay. Comprehensive genetic tests revealed that all 3 children were carriers of multiple genetic anomalies resulting from endogamy. In 2002, 20 years after the initial discovery, a retired Margaret Wilson reflected on the case in an interview with a local newspaper. "What is most impressive, looking back, is how something so extreme could happen practically in everyone's sight. It wasn't just a cabin in the middle of nowhere, it was less than 30 kilometers from a city, in a country with resources and institutions allegedly capable of protecting the vulnerable. It makes one wonder how many other similar cases exist, hidden in remote valleys or in plain view, waiting for someone to pay attention." The original Shelton property, abandoned for years, was eventually sold by the state in 1990. The cabin collapsed over time, but the land remains a silent reminder of how extreme isolation can distort realities and perpetuate cycles of damage for generations. If you have watched until here, it is because you care about these cases that mark families forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here, so I can know who really cares about the search for the truth." Do not forget to like this video and share it with those who also value understanding the complexities of human nature and the importance of effective protection systems. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now to follow more investigations into cases that make us reflect on our society and collective responsibility.